Hi, welcome to Neuroverse, a podcast hosted by Carolina
and Clara, where we discuss all matters from neuroscience to philosophy and beyond. Welcome back to Neuroverse, and for our first episode of 2025, we bring to you yet another philosophy of a sense, and today we're going to be discussing the philosophy of smell, which is quite a unique topic that I definitely have never reflected so much upon. But preparing for this episode made me realize that smell is truly, truly one of the most unique senses. It's the most chemical of the senses, arguably the least conscious, and it's also the most underappreciated. Yet, it can shape both our conscious and subconsciously driven behaviors almost more than any other sense. Yeah, I want to start by highlighting that human beings, we actually tend to underestimate our olfactory ability. I myself didn't think that we are very good smellers, but I found that humans actually have an excellent sense of smell, even compared to other animals. And for some odors, humans can be more sensitive than rodents or even dogs. And we are also capable of tracking odor trails, and our behavioral states are very much influenced by our sense of smell as well. And I also wanted to pose a question to you, Carolina. Actually, I'm going to be posing a lot of questions to you throughout the episode.
Cool.
But for the first one, if you had to choose one sense to give up, which sense would you be most comfortable losing out of vision, smell, hearing, taste, or touch?
Wow, that is a very good question. And firstly, let me just say as well that, yeah, it was really cool researching about this topic. And I've also never reflected so much. And it's interesting that you ask me this question because I often feel like my sense of smell is kind of like my superpower, but not in a good way. Like I think my sense of smell is way too sensitive, and that can be really good, but it also can be really bad and inconvenient because going on the tube in London, you're met with an array of smells and it's not always the most pleasant. And that was something that I came across in terms of, is the sense of smell something that you would miss if you ended up not having it? And I do think that out of all the other senses, I think smell perhaps is the one I could live without the most easily. But it would still diminish my lived experience. But I do think out of all of them, it would be the one I would give up. What about you, Clara?
That's so interesting. I didn't know that about you. I don't think my sense of smell is particularly good nor bad, although I do think it fluctuates. And I have found that apparently smell is extremely plastic, which we'll get into later. So you can also like train it or lose it. But I think I would have said smell before reading more into this topic. And honestly, I was thinking about it this morning, and I never thought I would say this, but it might be vision. The reason being, I know, because we are obviously extremely visual creatures as humans, but I feel like I could have a very rich visual world internally. Like when I imagine things, it's visually mainly. Yeah, like you can't really imagine smells. And so if I were to lose that, I just wouldn't have that whole realm of being. And also, smell is so intricately linked with taste. If you lost your sense of smell, you wouldn't be able to taste. And I'm sure many people have experienced this with COVID-19 or other diseases. But there was this big thing about COVID influencing your ability to taste. And this is actually because of the impact that the virus had on the olfactory system. So I wouldn't want to live without both smell and taste. And also, last thing is I came across a lot of research into olfaction and mental health, but people who don't have an olfactory sense, so they have something called anosmia, they have extremely high rates of mental health issues like depression. And many people report having a really great fear of life-threatening things that come with losing your sense of smell, such as not being able to detect a gas leak or not being able to tell that food is rotten. So thinking about that, I was like, okay, yeah, actually, I think smell is very necessary for like basic survival, almost more than vision.
Yeah, that's really interesting. But I know that you said that you have a very rich visual imagination, and so do I. But don't you think that if you lost your sense of vision, you would also lose the ability to visualize things in your mind? And it's interesting to me that you said that you can't imagine smell. I think it is somewhat possible, but also one of the challenges with smell versus a visual stimuli in the way of how we categorize things. Visually, we can order things in front of us in a way and we can distinguish between them. Whereas smells, we can't really do that. We need to hold them in our imagination if we want to distinguish between smells.
Wait, so first of all, I don't think that losing your visual ability will make you also lose your ability to imagine. Um, Whether or not you would be able to imagine visually without ever having vision in the first place is a different question. But I had this discussion with someone before about can we imagine smells? And I think if I try really, really hard, some distinct smells I can imagine, but it's just a lot more difficult than visual imagination. What was the second thing you said? Oh yeah, the categorization. Yeah,
Mhm.
what exactly did you mean by categorization and how that has to do with imagination?
So, if you're presented with five different shapes and colors in front of you, you can easily say, that brown square and that yellow star and that orange circle are separate from each other, and you can categorize them because, in a visual sense, the spatial temporal features make it so that you can do that. But with smells, it's different. Like if you're in a perfume shop and you're trying different perfumes, in order to differentiate between them, it's not like you can look at all of the different perfumes at once. You need to smell them individually and then hold that smell in your imagination to compare it against the other ones. Smell is a lot harder to categorize.
Yeah, and I love this point. I totally agree, but I think this is ultimately actually a linguistic problem, which takes us back to our philosophy of color episode where we discuss the same
Mhm.
thing. But okay, before we move on to that, I just want to mention about imagination that I found it very interesting when I was trying to figure out why we can't imagine smells as easily. Biologically, smells are processed first in the olfactory bulb, which is then connected to higher order regions in the brain, like the olfactory cortex, which is the same way that many other sensory modalities are processed. For example, light goes into the retina and then it goes to the visual cortex. But all sensory information passes through a structure called the thalamus, except for olfactory information, which I find really interesting because the thalamus is involved in a whole load of functions, and we still don't know exactly what its role is, but it does, in general terms, relay information to higher order sensory areas and kind of regulate that flow of information. And it's also heavily implicated in the regulation of sleep, both REM, dreaming, and non REM deep sleep. And thinking about imagination, I was also thinking, do we dream of smells? Like, do you smell in your dreams?
No,
Do
I don't
you?
think I do.
Yeah, I don't think I do. And like, I can't recall a single instance where I have. And another thing linked to categorization is also smells are kind of instantaneous. Like, it's harder to remember them. So there is this idea that smells are less implicated in working memory. Working memory is like the retainment of information in the short term to then put things into context and use it for your current thinking. And so,
That's kind of what I was trying to get at with the different perfume analogy, in that it's hard to remember. Yeah.
yeah, exactly. And so I think like a lot of these may be actually relatable to the biological circuitry that mediates olfaction because the fact that the information kind of goes straight from the first sensing organ, the olfactory bulb, to the brain without the thalamus as a mediator might be why it's not as integrated into processes like working memory, which is required for imagination, and dreaming, that is regulated by the thalamus. So I thought that was really interesting. But on to the linguistic problem, which I find even more interesting. I think that a huge reason why we find it difficult to categorize smells is because we don't have the language to explain and categorize. Specifically, I'm speaking about English, since we're speaking English. And interestingly, this is not actually the case across languages. So there are fewer words to describe smells in English than any other senses, but there are some languages, mainly in hunter-gatherer communities and in small indigenous communities, that actually do have many words to describe smells. The reason for this could be because as we've built up more urban environments and, modernized our world, we essentially have shaped the olfactory landscape of our environments and actually diminished the diversity of smells that we face. Like you mentioned, the tube. Basically, we have created a lot of bad smells. Like if you think of natural smells, there are bad smells, but a lot of natural bad smells also have like a bit of good in them, if that makes sense. Or like they're more subjective, you know? But anyways, there's an idea that with the creation of more urban landscapes, our smells have just diminished in diversity. And so that's also why we can't explain them very well beyond stinky and yummy. But what's really interesting is some people have studied some of these indigenous communities and tried to understand how subjective perception of smells may be different compared to American English speakers. And there was a study in a group of nomadic hunter-gatherers in Thailand that speak a language called Manic. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right. But in that language, they use smells a lot for like daily activities like foraging and the use of medicinal herbs and rituals. And Manic has a rich vocabulary of words to describe like the more abstract qualities of smell. And there's another example of a language called Jahai that's spoken on the Malay Peninsula. And just like Manique, it also has a rich vocabulary of terms to describe smells. And when they compared Jahai speakers to American English speakers, it was found that English speakers were very inconsistent in their odor names across study participants. So different people used very different terms to describe the same smells. But Jahai speakers tended to use similar words to name the same odors, which basically demonstrates how the cultural context really shapes our ability to express perception. And inevitably, that would shape how we perceive it, right? Like if we had less vocabulary to describe smells, we wouldn't think as much about what we are smelling.
Yeah, that is so interesting. And that makes a lot of sense. And what you said about how the landscape, I guess, as well as the social circles that you're in, really affects your sense perception of smell, and how perhaps in a more natural environment, you're experiencing a wider array of scents, you're more attuned to the fine changes in scents. And then, like you mentioned, plasticity, potentially, we've lost a bit of that plasticity in our brain because we are only smelling the same like 10 scents every day as opposed to a whole forest.
Yeah, and it actually can be trained. And a lot of studies have looked at this in wine experts because, well, what I found out is essentially wine experts are not just talking crap. They actually know what they're talking about because they are able to detect more precisely certain odors that can be chemically tested in wines than novices. And this is interesting because it doesn't apply to detection of scents in general. Like wine experts would be able to detect a larger array within wines, but they won't be able to smell coffee odors better. Only coffee experts would be. So it just goes to show how specific olfactory expertise can be. And
Yeah.
related to that, I also found another study of wine experts comparing novices in New Zealand, and they asked them to name odors in wine and found that the wine experts were better at naming these odors, but both groups could detect whether a smell was present or absent at the same level of intensity. So it's again sort of related to linguistics because it's like if you were given a choice and you were a novice, you would still be able to tell, but only the experts would be able to put the name to the scent themselves without being prompted in a way. And there's another very similar study looking at another group of people with a type of dementia called primary progressive aphasia. And this actually mainly affects language, but these people have difficulty in naming smells. And so they showed that, yeah, these patients were much poorer than a control population at naming odors, getting it right only about 23% of the time, compared to around 58% of the time in control subjects. But when these aphasia patients were given a list of odors to choose from, they actually performed as well as the controls in identifying the smells, which suggests in these patients, because we know that there's damage to the brain, it's the connections between the olfactory and the language centers that are being most impaired and not the actual olfactory ability. And indeed, people have suggested that the reason we're worse at describing odors than other senses is because of, again, a biological reason of the olfactory centers not being connected to the language centers of the brain.
That's so interesting how it's so intertwined. And like you mentioned earlier, our ability to perceive and express ourselves in regards to our senses is so highly tied to the language. Talking about indigenous tribes, I was reading about like Western philosophy and how it places like a really big emphasis on the visual sense and how, even societally, you go to a flower shop and most roses are really beautiful to look at, but they're practically odorless. And that's because they've been bred over time to look really beautiful, but no thought or care has been given to the scent. And Carolyn Korsmeyer, a philosopher, she noted that there's a distance in Western philosophy between the object and the perceiver, and those are seen as more cognitive, moral, and aesthetic sensory experiences. And this has been associated with things like vision. Whereas the more proximal senses, so senses like smell, taste, and touch, are often associated to be more inferior by many other philosophers as well, like Plato and Aristotle, because they put us in physical contact with things, which I think is quite odd because for me, a really rich lived experience is one that is in contact with the physical things. And there was also this line that it's really interesting about how our sense of smell and our olfactory system is really providing the brain world interface, given that our nerves are right there in our nose. And so I just found it interesting how there's this divide even in Western philosophy, and that Plato, he says that the lack of naming that we have in regards to the sense of smell is not because they don't consist of a definite number of simple types, but it's because there are only two clear distinctions, pleasant and unpleasant. Aristotle went to so far as to expand on that a little bit and saying that we actually have two kinds of smells. One that is like function, like, if we smell a steak and we're hungry, that smell is quite positive. Whereas we also have a second one, which is the aesthetics of smell. So, like a rose, which has a nice, pleasant smell, but we don't see it in other animals. So, yeah.
Yeah, that's so interesting. And I think, yeah, it does highlight that a lot of Western philosophy is kind of based on like separateness. Like, if you even think about dualism or solipsism, which is a bit extreme, but it's all very much to do with the idea that like you are the subject and everything else around you are objects, right? And yeah, like you said, the olfactory nerve is like the only part of the whole nervous system that is in direct contact with the world, which is why would you want to lose that? It's so intimate. And I think a really good demonstration of this is the French philosopher Etienne Bernard de Condillac. He wrote treatises on the sensations, and in it reflected on our pre-linguistic cognitive abilities using a thought experiment. He asks readers to consider an originally inanimate being, so a statue, and what it would be like for the statue to come to know the world if it were to acquire each of its senses in isolation from the other. And the first sense is smell. And thought experiment involves the being, the statue, coming to life by smelling a rose. And interestingly, when it smells the rose, it experiences itself as being the rose. Condillac claimed that from its perspective, the odors are nothing other than its own modifications or manners of being. So, in other words, it will simply just be the smell of the rose. And then when it experiences different smells in succession, the memory of the earlier one may linger while the other ones become present, and then only then will the statue realize that smells endure through time and form these memories. And so I think this description of a novel olfactory experience really highlights two key things. The first one being that smells are absorptive and they're really linked to identity more than other senses. When we smell, the experience is more one of being rather than one of observing. And secondly, that smells last through time and are integrated in memory, which I think we can all relate to as well, because smells are definitely one of the strongest triggers for context-dependent memory. And this was also said by like many other philosophers. Kant said that for taking something in through smell is even more intimate than taking something in through the absorptive vessels of mouth or throat. And the psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan made the same point, saying that the olfactory is the only dimension that allows one to reduce distance to zero, which again goes back to the point of the olfactory nerve just dangling there in the world, sensing all of the chemicals around you.
Yeah, I love that quote. It's so amazing because it is true. It like with vision, it's like we mentioned, it's always at a distance. And Jean-Luc Nancy also says that when we see, vision does not penetrate, but it glides. Like it's there and we observe, but we're not immersed in it like we are with the olfactory senses.
Yeah. And something else I was thinking about today is that olfaction isn't only the smell itself, but also your olfactory system senses the air that is flowing through your nostrils. And so it's intimately linked to breathing. And actually, in a lot of, again, indigenous cultures or more ancient traditions, the olfactory is very much linked to breathing and health as well. But yeah, that also kind of made me think about how do we define smell, which is maybe how the episode should have started. But can we reduce smell to a single definition? And what are smells? And what I find really interesting is, obviously, I mentioned smells are the most chemical of senses, and that's because odors are chemicals. And some theories suggest that the olfactory quality can be fully accounted for in terms of the molecular structure of the chemical compounds that make up the odors, together with the concentration and/or ratio of the odors. An additional layer on this is that, as you mentioned with the categorization, and this may be again a linguistic problem, but when you combine different scents, it does sort of create a new scent most of the time. Yeah, it may be down to our ability to discriminate different smells, and so we can't like tease them apart. When we're smelling an essential oil blend, we can't easily tell what is in that blend. We just view it as like a thing of its own. So the quality is, again, more complex because it's not so much spatially discrete, as you said, such as vision or touch or even hearing would be.
Yeah.
But I did read that one study found that humans actually use a larger set of descriptions to describe odor qualities for molecular structures with a greater structural complexity, suggesting that molecular complexity plays a causal role in generating odor qualities.
Yeah, no, it's a cool phenomenon.
And I think what keeps coming up is that a lot of the philosophical ideas that come with olfaction can actually be quite well related to the biology. Maybe it's again because of our inability to linguistically reflect on our olfactory experiences that it makes it almost easier to relate to biology. Whereas, like other senses, which we can describe in so many different ways, we just hesitate to link it directly to biology.
Yeah, that's a good point. I guess that brings around again the distal versus proximal quality of our different senses. I didn't think that it would cause us to innately accept that the sense of smell doesn't have like an epistemological gap, that it's so consumable, you know?
Yeah, I have two related points. First of all, I have another question for you.
Okay.
Relatedly, do you think an olfactory experience involves more input from the object or the receiving subject?
Yeah, well, I think that this is quite similar to like you could ask the same question in regards to sound, I think, because there and vision as well, because there is a source and there is a receiver. There is the
Yeah,
source
we
of the
discussed this in the philosophy of sound episode a lot.
yeah,
Yeah.
there's the source of the where the odor is occurring and who is absorbing it or smelling it. I think that smell neurological, like it happens in the brain because it's the result of the interaction between the molecules and the olfactory nerves in your nose that then cause that feeling, that sensory experience of smell. And yeah, objects may have chemical properties that are aromatic, and so they may float through the air. But I guess what makes it a scent is if there is a receiver.
Yeah, so similar to our conclusion on sound. But I do feel like whereas sound is very much related to an object, like it requires an object to be physically made. And both sound and olfaction require a medium to traverse, air. It has to be air. It can't be, you can't smell underwater. Um, ooh, could you smell in a vacuum?
This is the exact same question as the sound one.
Yeah. Can odors travel in a vacuum? Probably not.
I don't think so.
Yeah. But anyways, back to my original point. I think that, like you bang a drum and a sound is made, it travels through an air and it reaches your ear. You shine a light upon a plate, it reflects red, it reaches your eyes, you perceive it. Okay. But smell, it's like the smell of a rose doesn't even really belong to the rose. Like it's produced by the rose, but the smell in itself is its own entity. That's how I see it. Like the odor molecules, if you want to reduce it to something physical, they are a thing of their own. I don't see them so much as part of the object. Like if a human smell, I actually have a very sharp sense of smell when it comes to other people. But I think that when other human beings smell, it tends to be like their laundry or their perfume. It's rarely their natural scents that I consciously smell, which then brings another issue of I think smell is one of the least conscious of the senses. We can so easily have our emotions just completely change because of a smell that we are not even conscious of.
So there's a lot to unpack there.
Yeah.
Firstly, I want to go back to the thing that you said about when humans smell, it's mainly perfume in their laundry. I mean, sure, but I do think that humans have like their own innate smell, and that kind of brings me to pheromones, which are more typically studied in animals, but there have been studies that show that we also produce these pheromones specifically in sweat and usually in the axillary glands, and men produce it more than women. But I think that goes back to my point that I think humans do have an innate smell of their own, and it's not just like laundry and perfume.
Yes, but how conscious is that innate smell? Like, can we actually consciously detect pheromones?
Yeah, I think that we can't consciously detect pheromones, but I guess we can associate a pleasant smell to an unpleasant smell. And if we're lucky, the pheromones.
Yeah, but I wouldn't really consider that as part of like conscious perception, which when we talk about like philosophy of the senses, I'm mainly thinking of the conscious experiences that we have because it may shape, in fact, it has been shown that it does shape who we spend time with. I actually came across a really interesting study about parents smelling their children, and they found that it was age dependent, so that parents found their young children's scents pleasant, but they found their adolescent children's scents unpleasant, which I think is quite self explanatory, to be honest. And this may be a biological mechanism to, encourage protection and parent child bonding when children are younger. But then in adolescence, they no longer need that support. And so parents are just not driven to spend time with their smelly, stinky teenagers. And those are not pheromones. Those are like scents that can still be consciously experienced, but they're often overlooked, I guess. So there is a spectrum of smells, and I think the power in how it shapes our behavior is mainly beyond our conscious perception.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I do agree with you. I think that there are a range of smells that are in our conscious experience and we, avoid or are attracted to like certain locations or people and we may be aware of it, but I think a lot of the underlying behavior could also be subconscious and even with things like imprinting in your memories.
Yeah, but ultimately, I just find it hard to grasp the idea that odors belong to an object. Like odors are properties of that object.
But if a rose is producing her own scent, then that scent belongs to the rose.
Yeah, but do you see how it's different to like an object being red because it has the capacity to absorb and emit certain wavelengths?
I don't know because okay, I think that the comparison with vision is tricky, but the comparison with sound is not that tricky because both involve particles moving.
Yeah, but the particles of sound are the sound itself is not the are not the particles. The sound is the movement.
Yeah. If anything, that makes the particles belong to the object even more. It's almost like the object is disseminating.
Yeah, like the odor particles are an extension of the object itself. But I
Yeah.
think it's maybe the spatial separation that I find difficult to grasp. Like the fact that, oh, this takes us back to what makes an individual. Yeah, like the fact that if I exude pheromones and they travel 10 miles, am I still that? Or worse, like if they go into someone else's nose.
Which they probably will.
hmm
Yeah, I do think it brings us back to the question of what is an individual. And I kind of like the idea of these uncertain boundaries that objects may have in the example of smell and how it's all just one big interaction. It's one big molecular interaction.
Yeah. Yeah, and another thing to highlight is related to the subjectivity of smells. Like, not everyone has the same olfactory experience, but I think smell for olfaction, we have pretty strong biological evidence again that this is the case just because of how olfactory processing works. So it's taken like most of the episode, but I do want to explain a little bit of the neuroscience of olfaction and see how that can be related to the philosophy. But essentially, odorants are detected by olfactory sensory neurons, which are located in the olfactory epithelium in the nasal cavity, so the top of your nose. And each olfactory sensory neuron expresses one specific type of receptor. There are thousands of different receptor genes, and each one can only be activated by a specific odorant molecule. And so, multiple olfactory sensory neurons with the same receptor will then project to and synapse within the same structure in the olfactory bulb, which is where the first synapse of the olfactory pathway is found. This is called a glomerulus or glomeruli, where these OSNs of the same receptor type are clustered. And then there's several local circuits within that that then regulate onward processing. And every human being can express a different set of olfactory receptors. I mean, we all express many, many different olfactory receptors, but they are not going to be identical across human beings. So, of course, if there is a specific odorant that one person has a receptor for and another person doesn't, then regardless of anything that happens beyond that, we know that some of it is going to, like, some people will experience it and some people just won't. The other interesting thing is that, as I mentioned, the olfactory bulb is extremely plastic, meaning that it has a huge regenerative capacity. It's one of the most plastic and regenerative places in the nervous system, and one of the only locations in the adult brain that is known to constantly produce new neurons throughout life, meaning that our sense of smell can be regenerated and it can be trained, as I mentioned, depending on the environment that we're in.
That's so interesting. I didn't know that. What do you think is the evolutionary advantage to have such regeneration in the olfactory bulb?
Yeah, I think, first of all, because the plasticity is driven by environmental factors, like the odorants that we receive, the fact that that environment is highly dynamic because it's in the nose, not in the skull, that intuitively makes sense that it would drive plasticity. Evolutionarily, I think that olfaction is a sense that because it impacts subconscious behavior so much, it is highly necessary for survival. And so perhaps that's the reason why it's more plastic.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. I guess if it guides a lot of social dynamics as well, we are constantly in an ever-changing society. So I guess it makes sense why it needs to be able to keep up.
Yeah, a lot of plasticity in the nervous system is driven by changes in activity, and changes in activity are driven by changes in sensory stimuli. And so I think it really is that dynamicism of olfactory environments. But also, like all evolution, it could just be by chance. Like, how come our retinas are not super plastic if they're always being exposed to ranging light levels? And yeah, so.
Yeah.
And another really cool thing that I only just discovered is olfactory receptors. They don't only exist in our nose. They're also found in other body parts like the skin, the liver, the prostate, and muscles. And it's unknown what the function of these olfactory receptors really are and the degree to which it influences human experience and health.
That is so crazy. I didn't realize you were talking about humans at first because I know that fruit flies, they can taste with their feet. So like the chemotaxis is on their feet. And yeah, what is the purpose for humans to have olfactory receptors on our skin?
Yeah, I don't know. And also, again, that might just be like an artifact of evolution or development. Like, not everything has to have a function.
Hmm. But I feel like it usually dies if it doesn't have a function.
Yeah, but there's like lots of artifacts in our bodies that are just kind of there because they once had a function, or it's more like they don't have a dysfunction.
Hmm.
Yeah, but your point about the social role of olfaction stands, but I think that that's very human specific. Well, not only human specific, I mean, there's several animals that use their sense of smell to form bonds. But the societal context that also, again, brings in linguistics and how our perception is based on our ability to communicate that with the society that isn't so applicable to non-linguistic animals. So I'm not sure how much the societal benefits have actually impacted the development of smell or if it has just been utilized for the development of societal interactions. Yeah. No, this is so strange to think about that olfaction almost seems to be like very survival and instinctively driven. But it also has this strong social role, which, again, if you think about other senses, that doesn't really happen. It's not like vision or hearing has a social role. Touch does have a social role, perhaps, again, because it is more intimate, as is olfaction. But, like, how much is touch important for survival? Doesn't feel like it's that important. So, olfaction really is like unique in that it has either end of the spectrum. And I guess as we've discussed, like that's the difficulty in entangling what its original function is or like what its main function is.
Yeah. The fact that in the neuroanatomy it skips the thalamus, I find it really fascinating and it makes me feel that it's a more primitive thing in a way.
Yeah,
Um,
and maybe our social behavior is actually more primitive than we think. Like it's just part of human nature. And so they're not opposite ends of the spectrum. Maybe they're actually very highly connected.
yeah.
And yeah, so to wrap up, I read a fascinating article about olfaction, mental health, and the environment, and how we have to prioritize understanding olfaction and prioritize creating olfactory environments that are natural to improve our mental health. So I just wanted to end by a few sentences from the article that stood out about the importance of olfaction. It said human beings are chemosensory communicators, a capacity we share with many other species in the natural world. We live in reciprocal relationship with nature through interactions in the airborne chemical environment, a context that our actions can degrade, like generating air pollution or losing forest or grassland cover via climate change, or enhance, like creating natural urban greenscapes and conserving large natural areas. Given the rapid environmental change, it is urgent that we increase attention to the critical contributions that natural environments make to human olfactory experiences and well-being.
Yeah. That was so nice.
Yeah,
That was really well said.
not my words.
That's inspired me to make sure I enrich my environment and have more olfactory stimuli.
Yeah, it's really inspired me to be conscious of natural smells. Like what is the smell of moss? Like what is the smell of soil or like the sea?
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's such a good point. I I'm also going to be paying more attention to natural scents.
Thank you for listening to today's episode. If you enjoyed the episode, follow us on Instagram at neuroverse_pod and check out our website, neuroversepod.com, for more information.